Hello, and welcome to History 361, Lecture 7, Slavery and the Limits of Democracy. This is Afro-American History to 1877, New Mexico State University, and I am Professor Jamie Bronstein. Today I'm going to be talking about the status of slavery in the new nation. Okay, so in July 1787, the Congress met to organize the U.S. territories northwest of the Ohio River into prospective states. This was still the Articles of Confederation Congress. Its members agreed to ban slavery in these territories. But despite the fact that the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in some U.S. territories, it tacitly consented to slavery south of the Ohio River. The Constitutional Convention, and the Constitutional Convention met in the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention left slavery status in the existing states to be decided by those state legislatures. The 55 delegates charged with creating the nation agreed to allow slavery to exist within the borders of the new nation. The founders also protected the slaveholders' right to own slaves. The Constitution had a fugitive slave clause, later reinforced by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and both of these prohibited individuals from sheltering or emancipating slaves who had run away from their masters. Roger Sherman of Connecticut pointed out that if someone's horse ran away, public funds were not spent to return the horse, and that if Southern states were going to treat their enslaved people as property, then they should be treated similarly to runaway horses. However, Southern representatives argued that runaway slaves were a threat to public order in a way that runaway horses were not. Even though many people found the slave trade to be morally abhorrent, Southern states demanded that it be protected for a period of 20 years. The founders had to answer difficult questions surrounding slaves and federal representation. Slaveholding states wanted slaves to be counted for representation in the House of Representatives, but didn't want them to be taxed. Delegates from free states wanted slaves to be taxed, but didn't want slaves calculated in the number of representatives designed for each state or designated for each state. Now, this makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Slaveholding states treated enslaved people as property, but also wanted to benefit from them being enumerated as persons for the purpose of determining how many Congress people each new state would send. In contrast, Northern representatives said, look, be consistent. If you're going to say that enslaved people are property, then you should pay taxes on them, but you shouldn't get to count them as people for the purpose of representation. The Three-Fifths Compromise attempted to balance the opposing interests of slave and free states by saying, okay, each slave will be enumerated as 3/5 of a free person in determining the state's tax burden and representation. So just to say that another way, they weren't saying enslaved people were 3/5 of a white person. They were saying we're going to count up all of the enslaved people and take that number, and 3/5 of that number will be added to the total census count of white people, and that will give Southern states their representation. The Three-Fifths Compromise disproportionately benefited Southern slaveholders. So just to give you some numbers, in 1790, 694,207 slaves lived in the South. By 1860, 4,953,760 slaves lived in the South. And so Southern states had greater representation in Congress than they would have had otherwise due to the presence of enslaved people. As a result, the South controlled the presidency and the Supreme Court for most of the antebellum era. White Southerners built their fortunes and owed much of their political influence to the number of Africans that they held captive. Nonetheless, there were some inroads made into slavery by a wave of manumissions that spread throughout the Upper South during the Revolutionary era. And again, just to remind you, manumission is the legal process of emancipating your slave. You go through a process of providing free papers to the slave. Robert Carter, heir to a large fortune in Virginia, manumitted 509 enslaved people, settling them on 400 acres of his land and kicking out white tenants in order to do so. But he was the exception rather than the rule. There is a picture of Robert Carter on your slide. By the 1780s, tobacco production waned in Virginia and Maryland. Planters invested in wheat instead, which required fewer workers. During the colonial period, planters in Georgia and South Carolina had experimented with cotton, hemp, flax, and food crops to expand agricultural production beyond indigo and rice. However, the cotton that these planters produced never became a significant export commodity because it required much of the winter to clean, card, and spin. Cotton had little commercial appeal because it required too much work to be cost-effective. During the Revolution, boycotts of British goods and Britain's blockades on colonial exports made colonists interested in homespun textiles. The market for homegrown products increased as homespun clothing became a symbol of patriotism rather than one of poverty. All right, so Americans are going to start thinking more about producing their own textiles for wearing. In the 1790s, Southern planters turned to sugar and cotton. Louisiana and Florida became the nation's primary sugar producers, and Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 facilitated the processing of cotton. So what the cotton gin does is remove the impurities in the cotton that previously had to be done by hand. The cotton gin mechanizes that process. Cotton became the most widely cultivated staple crop, and it flourished in the Lower South. The Georgia and South Carolina Sea Islands were the first southern sites where cotton was produced for large-scale sale and export. Consistently warm weather in the region promoted the production of long staple or long fibered cotton, an easily cleaned premium variety. A short staple variety known as upland cotton flourished on the mainland. This variety of cotton required intensive cleaning, and the cotton gin made mass production of this short staple cotton commercially viable. The cotton gin revolutionized cotton production. Before the cotton gin, cleaning 1 or 2 pounds of cotton took an entire day. With the cotton gin, 50 pounds of cotton could be cleaned by one worker in a day. Thus, the production of upland cotton in the South soared from 150,000 pounds a year in 1793 to 6.5 million pounds in 1795, and the region produced well over 100 million pounds annually by 1815. Large-scale cotton production increased the need for slave labor and encouraged wealth-seeking planters to move farther south and west in search of land. Between 1790 and 1820, more than 250,000 white migrants from Virginia and Maryland moved to South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Missouri. Wealthy settlers brought their slaves with them, and others used cotton profits to buy slaves in foreign and domestic slave markets. Even before the cotton boom, Georgia and South Carolina had been short of slaves. Georgia had lost 2/3 of its slave population during the Revolutionary War, and South Carolina may have lost up to 1/4 of its slaves. Southern planters used militia forces and Native American slave catchers to hunt down slaves who had escaped to maroon communities in swamps and backwoods. Others purchased slaves from Africa and the Caribbean before 1808, when the United States withdrew from the international slave trade. But an increasing number of slaves in the Lower South were purchased from slaveholders in the Chesapeake and the North. Between 1790 and 1820, nearly 170,000 slaves were transferred to frontier plantations from these regions. The number of slaves on cotton plantations also grew rapidly as a result of vigorous rates of natural increase. Cotton fueled the growth of northern industries and quickly emerged as the nation's premier export crop. While cotton benefited the nation and the planters who produced it, the increased demand for slave labor to work on cotton plantations and the changes that this demand imposed on the domestic slave trade, or the internal slave trade, ripped enslaved families apart. For the slaves who worked on cotton plantations, the labor required was backbreaking and menial: clearing new land, planting, picking cotton, pressing bales, beating down stems. So, grueling work routines, all for the planters' benefit. Slaves had little time to cultivate their own provisions or to care for their families. However, slaves from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Upper South, who found themselves on cotton plantations in frontier states, attempted to forge new bonds, despite the fact that they were separated from their families. Slaves in the Upper South lost their families to the domestic slave trade. For example, Charles Ball of Calvert County, Maryland, lost his mother and siblings to separate purchasers when he was 4 years old. When Ball was older and had a family of his own, he was sold away from his new family. Ball eventually escaped, settled in Pennsylvania, and wrote a memoir that recorded his experience. Long hemmed in by Spanish, French, and Native American land claims, the United States took advantage of imperial struggles in Europe and the Caribbean at the turn of the century to expand its national boundaries. Okay, so France, as you know, had a large portion of what would later become the internal part of the United States, the Louisiana Purchase, but they also had a large colony on the island that would become Haiti. There were plantations there, they were growing sugar, and just after the French Revolution in 1789, more than 100,000 enslaved rebels on Haiti burned the plantations, killed their owners, and shut down sugar production, and the revolution impacted the New World. Sugar was in short supply. White planters who fled Haiti took refuge in the lower Mississippi Valley, and they resumed sugar production there. France never regained control of Haiti, despite the fact that Napoleon Bonaparte tried to re-enslave Haiti's former slaves and captured the leader of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, who died in a French jail in 1803. This is the reason why France was forced to reevaluate its colonial plans and decided to sell the Louisiana Territory to the Americans. President Thomas Jefferson sent James Monroe to France in 1802 to offer $10 million for the city of New Orleans and any holdings west of the Mississippi that the French were willing to sell. France said, made a counteroffer. How would you like to buy the entire Louisiana Purchase for $15 million? And so Jefferson decided to do this, adding 828,000 square miles of land to the United States. All or portions of present-day Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, and Oklahoma were acquired in this purchase. The new land was well suited for cotton production, and there were even more waves of westward migration. With the exception of Richmond, Virginia, the lone southern city that used slave labor to produce manufactured goods within its city limits, most southern cities were commercial hubs and major slave trading centers with very small slave populations. In the South, most slaves were shipped off to rural areas for agricultural production. Free blacks populated cities in increasing numbers where slave populations declined. For example, Baltimore's free black population soared after 1810. When Maryland planters abandoned tobacco and began to produce wheat, Baltimore became a primary site for milling grain into flour and other cereals. Baltimore's workers made barrels for shipping grains and other agricultural exports, and they built roads, warehouses, and other buildings. Once agricultural production slowed in the region, the, quote, surplus slaves who worked in the city were sold south to fill the demands of cotton planters, leaving free blacks to flock to Baltimore to fill the city's need for laborers. Fearing being sold south, fugitive slaves also flocked to Baltimore. Maryland slaveholders often suspected that their missing slaves had fled there where they could pose as free people. The benefits that slaveholders derived from maintaining urban slavery were never as clear-cut as they were in the rural South. One way urban slaveholders profited from slavery was through the, quote, hiring out system. Hiring out allowed slave masters to contract out their slaves for anywhere from 1 day to a year. Those who employed or hired out the slaves were not obligated to house or feed them, and some enslaved people were allowed to retain a portion of their pay and were given the freedom to find their own lodging. This practice, known as living out, allowed slave masters to gain profits from their slaves' labor without incurring the cost of their upkeep. Hiring out gave slaves a degree of freedom that worried white Southerners. These enslaved people were unsupervised, made their own working arrangements, and maintained close contact with free blacks. Now, just take a moment to think about this hiring out and living out system. As an enslaved person, you have a set of skills, you do a regular length workday, you get to keep a little bit of your earnings in order to clothe and feed yourself and pay rent, but everything else gets paid to somebody else who owns your person, who legally owns your person. Your wages above and beyond the bare subsistence don't belong to you. If there were an absurd sort of version of slavery, that was certainly it. Urban slaves did not see their relative independence as any kind of relief from their slave status. I mean, they understood the absurdity of their own position. Gabriel, an enslaved blacksmith who lived outside of Richmond, Virginia with his brothers on a tobacco plantation belonging to his owner, Thomas Prosser, led a plot to overturn slavery in Richmond during the summer of 1800. Gabriel was inspired by both the American and the Haitian revolutions, which signaled that the oppressed could overthrow their oppressors. Like Haitian slaves, Gabriel hoped to take advantage of political and social tensions among whites in Virginia, which ran high in the months preceding the 1800 election. Gabriel and his brothers intended to recruit about 1,000 slaves to attack Richmond's wealthy white population while sparing the city's poor whites. Gabriel was hoping that the poor whites and local anti-slavery advocates like Methodists and Quakers would join in the rebellion. His recruits were American-born, skilled laborers and artisans who worked in Richmond. He wanted to carry a flag during the rebellion that read, "Death or Liberty," and took advantage of the unrestricted movement granted to urban hired-out slaves to hold planning meetings at local taverns, and even traveled to country barbecues and revival meetings to recruit rural slaves. Word of Gabriel's revolt, or at least the plans thereof, spread across the Virginia countryside, but 2 slaves told their master about the plot, and he quickly alerted Virginia's governor, James Monroe. 6 of Gabriel's comrades were immediately captured, and militia tracked down the remaining 20. Gabriel was the last to be captured, and he was taken back to Richmond in irons. There he was tried and executed along with the 25 others. More slaves were indicted, but a Virginia law mandated compensation to slaveholders when their slaves were convicted of capital crimes. All right, so ironically, they didn't want to indict too many people involved in Gabriel's rebellion because the government would then end up paying money to slaveholders in exchange for their slaves. Thomas Jefferson thus recommended to James Monroe that the rebels be sold outside of the United States instead. Gabriel's plot failed, but it made Virginians fear the slaves in their midst. Another rebellion plot was discovered in 1802, and the Virginia General Assembly discussed getting rid of slavery or negotiating with President Jefferson to create a place where African Americans might be emancipated or be sent to or choose to live. Virginia lawmakers responded to Gabriel's plot by securing the state capital's arsenals, instituting nightly police patrols, outlawing slaves hiring out of their own time, banning slave gatherings, and prohibiting slaves from traveling without a pass from their masters. As a result of Gabriel's rebellion, restrictions were placed on free blacks as well. Free blacks and the independence they enjoyed were identified as an inspiration for slave rebellions. In 1802, Virginia lawmakers banned any, quote, Negro or mulatto from getting a ship pilot's license, and free blacks were also required to present free papers upon demand and to register as free Negroes and mulattoes in their respective towns. Opportunities for blacks to pass from slavery to freedom all but disappeared throughout the South after Gabriel's rebellion. In 1806, Virginia legislators reversed laws that made manumission a private matter and enacted laws that required newly emancipated slaves to leave the state within 12 months or forfeit their freedom. Newly freed blacks and their masters could petition to exempt individuals from the law, but the code mandated that legal freedom could only be secured in the North, which separated free blacks from family and friends. Virginia courts were overwhelmed with free black requests to remain in Virginia, so the legislature authorized the county courts to allow free blacks of, quote, extraordinary merit to stay. All right, so people often wonder why it was that there were not more rebellions of enslaved people in the South during the period of slavery. Well, first of all, there were plenty, although not all of them were recorded for posterity or really remembered. And second of all, you can see that every time people attempted to rebel by force, there was a huge crackdown, not only against the participants, but also against the rest of the community. So it really was a no-win situation for the enslaved in the South in the early Republic period. Okay, see you in the comments.